Nicky is the second generation co-owner of the very famous Shu Hai Lo collection in Singapore. Shu Hai Lo was started by Nicky's father, Yo Ki Lim, a Teochew businessman who began collecting in Singapore in the 1940s. Today, Shu Hai Lo is one of the most important and precious collections of modern Chinese masterworks outside of mainland China. And then next to Nicky, we have Lo Zui. Zui is the Group Director for Museums at the National Heritage Board of Singapore. We are really fortunate to have Zui on the panel with us today because he's incredibly knowledgeable and experienced in this field. Between 2018 and 2024, Zui was the CEO for the Singapore Chinese Cultural Centre. And prior to that, he was also the Director for Curatorial Collections and Education at the National Gallery, Singapore. Lastly, next to Zui, we have Melvin Po, the owner of Singapore Mo Yuan Tang Collection. So, Singapore Mo Yuan Tang Collection currently holds one of the largest and most comprehensive collection of Singapore artist Lim Tze Peng's work. For those of you who have had time to explore the exhibition outside in the main hall and the room, you will notice that Melvin's collection covers the beginning and the end of Lim Tze Peng's journey. Currently, Melvin is also the third generation collector to many of these historic Chinese paintings surrounding us in the room today. So the collectors that are in this room and the expert in this room, they have had very different journeys and very different perspectives on this topic of collecting and guarding these treasures in our home ground. We're very excited for this session to begin. To start, I will begin a question for Nicky. Because Nicky is primarily Mandarin speaking, so our conversation will be conducted mainly in Mandarin. So I'd like to invite Nicky to share with everyone the story behind the founding of Shu Hai Lo Collection.
谢谢。秀海螺其实是我父亲在50年代就开始已经是对外有收藏，不过50年代的收藏并不是为了收藏，是为了生意上的来往，因为通常过年过节都要送礼嘛。我父亲就觉得送艺术比较实际，所以他就开始买了一些花，就送给生意的朋友做礼物。结果那些生意的朋友都很喜欢，因为他送的都是那些名家的齐白石这些，所以他们就很快的就把生意做成了。所以开始他就开始对这个说话艺术都很有兴趣，所以开始就产生了大兴趣。那么秀海螺是在我们这个先驱的国际画家南洋画派的画家的创始人之一陈胜瑞陈周瑞这个画家他说还有对我父亲的那个书斋取一个斋号，所以他就在1972年就取了一个秀海螺。那么我们在1974年，陈周瑞这个画家就帮我们出了第一本。
出了第一本叫做银海遗珠的一本画册，这个是第一本画册他出版的，所以秀海螺就是从这里开始的。
Many apologies. We are only down with one mic due to the recording. So for the next question that we'd like to ask is, because Nicky's father was around at a time when there were so many contemporary Chinese artists and collectors in the region, so perhaps Nicky could share with us some of these artists and collectors that were in the circle in those times.
在60年代、70年代，新加坡是有四个大藏家的，那时候是这么说的。那么其中一个是银行家刘作筹，他是有一个斋号叫做虚白斋，还有一个商人是陈之初，他是有一个商号叫做 什么白没有香雪堂、香雪砖。那么这两个藏家呢，其实他是跟我父亲有一点生意来往的，因为那个银行家他以前是在四海通嘛，我们有生意来往。那么商人陈之初他是做生意的，我们也是有跟他生意来往，所以我们就时常有交流。我父亲有一些画是跟他们买的，也有一些买的一些画要鉴定，就请他们来鉴定，大家三撮，问题这张画是可以不可以买？那么也有一些是他们卖给我父亲，就这样。所以早期的那个本地的收藏家是在这一方面的。如果讲到中国的画家或鉴定家，他们来新加坡的时候，比如讲说那个谢之流啦、刘海粟其他的画家，他们到新加坡来都一定会到我家来拜访，然后我们就会做一个午宴还是晚宴，在我们家里。大家吃饭交流。那么我家的时候是每次他们来，我们都可以调130张画，所以我们就会看是什么艺术家来，还是什么鉴定家来，我们就调不同的画，一定会调那个来拜访的那个画家的画1-2张了，其他的都是不同的画，让大家欣赏，而且大家交流这张画的来源好不好，就是我们以前是这样的交流的。
And the next question that I'm sure for all the collectors here, we're very curious to know is what are some of the collecting strategies that collectors tend to have when they are in the circle of artists, and other contemporary collectors who may have eye for different pieces of works. 就想请您分享一下您的父亲是以怎么样的收画的策略来面对他这么多个画家和藏家在他的圈子里，他怎么选哪一些画家是值得他可以收藏的？
早期收藏的画跟现在收藏是不一样的，因为早期的科技没这样发达嘛，也没有手机，也没有电脑，所以收藏是比较麻烦的。那我父亲他比较兴趣的是那个科举，以前清朝、明朝都有科举人嘛，科举人就是第一名是状元嘛，第二名是半元嘛，第三名是探花，第四名是进士，所以他对这些名人他都很有兴趣，所以他每当他要买一张作品的时候，他就会去查那个经典，说这个人是不是状元还是探花还是半元，然后他才会去进行去要以什么价钱来买。那么他到后期，因为后期到了90年代。拍卖公司开始流行的，那么他就改变成比较容易收购，所以他就改去收古画。因为新加坡据我所知，收古画的人应该是很少，所以他在90年代之后，他就比较说是在收古画。那么90年代之前，他收近现代还有书法，他书法还收得蛮齐全的。
So on this note, I would also like to pose the next question to Melvin, because Melvin's journey is very different from Nicky. Melvin started collecting Singapore artists' works, including artists like Lim Tze Peng, Cheong Shu Peng, Chen Wenxi. But somehow, in the recent few years, Melvin has started to pivot his collection to focus on modern Chinese art. And maybe, Melvin, you can share with us why did you choose to have this turn in direction, and what draws you to modern Chinese art?
Yeah. First of all, maybe I speak English first. I thank everybody for coming today, and I especially want to thank my guests, Mr. Lo Ziwi and Mr. Yo, for coming today. 首先呢，谢谢大家过来跟我们一起分享互动啊。第一，我真的要谢谢杨先生。你们不懂知不知道，杨先生是非常少出面在大众跟人家讲话的，对吧？这很少出现。所以今天你们是很有福气来听到讲，有些故事都是我第一次听到的，他跟我们分享。他也不知道我有一次去他家，他真的是挂了很多画，然后是我第一次接触到这些中国书画，所以也是受到很大的影响。 他家里还有很大幅的徐悲鸿还有很多很多重要的画家都还在他家里，对吗？李先生 ？Okay, so back to the question. Actually, I started out collecting Singapore artists first. So, although I have a large Lim Tze Peng collection, I also have Chong Su Ping, Chen Wenxi, Liu Kang, some of these important artists. So I was first introduced to Mr. Yeo. Mr. Yeo is also the chairman of Singapore Tongchai Medical Institution, 新加坡同济医院主席，现在是主席。And I was a director there. So he introduced me to another collector called Mr. Chan Kok Hua from Chu Zai Collection. So when I started collecting in 2017, I went to Hong Kong to view the auctions at Sotheby's and Christie's. So I was only focused on Chinese painting, Singapore paintings at the time. So I went to see that, but because the exhibition was so big, so I also went over to the Chinese section to have a look. And then there I met other Singapore collectors. And then from there I started to look at Chinese paintings, and then there was the interest developed from there. Does that answer the question? Okay, so the Chinese painting is, in a way, there's a very rich history to Chinese painting. Chinese paintings has probably been around for almost 3,000 years. I mean, since the Chinese civilization, even longer. So the way the paintings have developed, the variety is much, probably from a Chinese ink perspective, it's maybe a bit different, a bit more rich. And actually somehow I was also drawn to the fact that Singapore used to be a very large collectors. We have a large collector base for Chinese paintings. So Singapore used to be like a rich cousin to Chinese community. So all the rich people or the richer Singaporeans used to send money back to China. So we are known to be the richer cousins of the Chinese. And all the Chinese paintings actually came to Singapore at that time. So from there, and because of the attachment to the Chinese roots, so a lot of people continue to collect Chinese paintings. But I think as the Chinese became richer themselves and they buy back all the paintings, and all the paintings start to go back. So we have this big gap now where, and as we become more English educated, then this collection sort of became lesser and lesser. So I just thought that since I know Mr. Yeo, his father's story is very inspiring and no other, so I thought, okay, maybe I can start this collection, try to inspire more Singaporeans to collect Chinese art as well.
Well, maybe I can just add on to what Melvin had said, and to also link to what Mr. Yeo mentioned just now. Singapore has seen a very interesting history of collecting, because I guess from the mid-19th century onwards, even though we were a British colonial port city, but our society became predominantly Chinese. And as the city became more wealthy, the wealthier Chinese started to collect art, and I guess because of their Chinese background, the type of art that they collected would be Chinese painting and calligraphy. So in the earlier 20th century, before the war, many Chinese artists like Liu Haisu, Xu Beihong would come to Singapore, basically because there were wealthy Chinese businessmen who collected, and they bought works to support these Chinese artists. So I will put Mr. Yeo's father, Yang Qilin, as one of these type of wealthy Chinese businessmen. And I would say that even after the war, and when Singapore became independent, the collecting continued, because after 49, the Communist Party came to power, and essentially collecting became kind of not encouraged within China. So there was no market for ink paintings or calligraphy, and therefore many important works left China, or artists could only sell to overseas collectors during that time. So collectors in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan became important buyers of Chinese ink painting. So which is why Mr. Yo's, I think, collection, the Xiu Hai Lo collection, expanded so rapidly from the 50s, 60s, 70s onwards. And particularly during the Cultural Revolution, even more works came out of China. So I guess it was only after the revolution ended and when China opened up, and then subsequently in the year 2000, when China's own economy boomed, so collectors in China became wealthier themselves. And then as a group, of course, they numbered much more than the collectors in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and therefore you start to see very good works start to flow back towards the mainland China. So I guess Melvin coming on board in the year 2000 or so represents one of the rare collectors now in Singapore who are actively still buying Chinese works of art.
Thank you, Zui. That was such a great sharing of, a summary of the history of Chinese art collecting in early Singapore. And then moving on to the next question for Nicky, which we want to ask, as a second-generation collector, how does your collecting method and strategies differ from your father, who started the collection? 您的收藏策略跟您的父亲有哪些不同或者相关的一些地方吗？
收藏策略当然是早期不一样，早期的那个画一张都是60块、100块，起码是我们早期也买过60块的、100块的，跟现在是差很远。现在的那个市场的那价钱都跟以前一个天一个地嘛，所以不是说跟以前这样要买就买了，因为收藏家其实是要有时间要有钱。不过我听过香港一个藏家他在一个论坛讲过，其实收藏家是有时间没有钱，因为他的钱都是买那个画了，所以手上的钱是不多的。所以策略其实是大同小异的，就是只是不一样的，就是没有像以前这么样的大量的买，是看兴趣的话还是一些是需要支持的话才有买。
So then, the next question for Melvin on this area of collecting. Since you're I suppose, the first generation in your own family to begin such an extensive collection, how do you see art as part of estate building, and what are your collecting strategies, given that the prices are so high right now in today's context?
Actually, I think that Singapore art is relatively cheap. You see, we pay millions of dollars for houses. We spend millions of dollars on cars. We spend $500,000 on a watch. So really, but we have to think very hard when you spend $50,000 on a painting. So this is one of the. I mean, as a businessman, I'm thinking like that. I think Singaporeans, we have the ability. We have the ability to collect. We have the mentality and the way to appreciate the fine things, and we have the right proper museums to educate people. I think it's just a matter of time when people start to appreciate our local artists a bit better. And you can see from the Lim Tze Peng's works, I mean, he's a great artist. 60 years of works we have demonstrated. He's really probably one of the best. He was good enough to be invited to China, to Namok, which is the National Art Museum of China， 就是那个中国美术馆 ，to exhibit there in their home ground on a Chinese ink. And he remains the first Singaporean to be invited to both Namok of Beijing and Liu Haisu Museum in Shanghai. So he is one of the best. And all our Singapore artists' works are very, very good. I collect Ong Kim Seng. He's not here today, but Amy is a wonderful artist for his watercolor skills. He's got so many awards, international awards. I mean, we have a lot of talents among us, but somehow we haven't really pivoted to collecting. So I hope one day these precious treasures will find the right level. And I forgot your question actually. Why did I start collecting? Yeah, and I actually purely out of interest. I mean, we have walls at home to fill. Why buy anything else? Why buy commercial art? You know, we are all Singaporeans. Do a little bit for our Singapore artists. Support Singapore. Support local. Buy our own stuff. This is one section of my collection. I mean, I collect Chinese, Singapore artists as well. Chen Wenxi, Zhong Su Ping, and Ong Kim Seng, and a few other good artists. Yeah.
So on this note, what are your views on cultivating your next generation, like your children, to perhaps one day take over the collection? Yeah, and this question we'll also like to pose to Nicky afterwards.
I myself started collecting art when I was past 40 years old. So I think the children, yeah, 子孙自有子孙福 lah. Let them decide for themselves if they want to collect and if they have the interest. I think at this young age, they are probably more interested to find work, build up their career, start their families, and later on then become look at the final things of life. I mean, as with all of us, I think you also know from your own personal journey, only after you feed your stomach, you know, you establish yourself in work, then you have a bit more time. So I hope they remain interested, but I won't force them. The art is hanging around the house. If they don't appreciate it, then it will become my retirement fund. Hopefully I can, at some point, get a bit older and I can sell them off for, and as they appreciate over time, hopefully, yeah.
我认为我的下一代人应该不会对艺术有兴趣，因为这个东西其实当然是要看他们自己的兴趣，不过也要有培养的。我会产生兴趣是早期，因为我其实10多20岁的时候，每次我父亲有人来家里吃饭雕花，都是我在雕的。然后他买这幅画，以前没有通信嘛，不发达，买到放在地下，我们就拿那个印章的词典来对，看印章对不对。印章对的话，可能就是真的；印章不对就是假的。我们在做这个工作，所以就产生了很多兴趣。现在下一代的人都是以生活不一样嘛。而且他们都是，我看他们是比较喜欢看到现金，还多过看过那个艺术品，所以也不懂下一代的人可能，我的下一代可能就不知道。
So maybe at this point we'll move to a discussion on Lim Tze Peng's art. I'm not sure if everyone has had a chance to take a look at the huge exhibition outside of this room. And because we have Zui here today, so we'll also like Zui to provide us very expert opinions on what do you think distinguishes Lim Tze Peng's work from other Singapore ink artists or even in the wider global ink context?
Okay, so I guess Lim Tze Peng is quite special for a few reasons. Of course, in Singapore, we do have a number of very well-known ink artists, our pioneers, like Chen Wenxi, Fang Changqian, Shi Xiangtuo. But all our pioneers, without exception, were all born in China. and all of them were educated in the art academies in China. And it was just before or just after the war that they eventually came to Singapore to settle down and then develop careers here. Lim Tze Peng is unlike them. He was born here. His entire education was here, and therefore he is what we call kind of a homegrown artist. And in fact, another thing that distinguishes Tze Peng from Chen Wenxi, from Fang Changqian, from Shi Xiangtuo was, although Lim Tze Peng had an interest in art and had, of course, attended art classes in secondary school, but he never went to a formal art academy, never went to a 美术学院, because the circumstances didn't allow him to. He just had to go out to work after graduating from secondary school. So in a sense, unlike our pioneer artists who were formally trained, academically trained, Tze Peng was, in most sense of the word, a self-taught artist. So through kind of his sheer interests and hard work over many years, he kind of cultivated that interest. On certain levels, Tze Peng is quite similar to our pioneers too, because our pioneer artists, when they were educated in Shanghai art academies, most of them were exposed to both Western oil painting as well as Chinese ink painting. So for artists like Chen Wenxi, Chuang Tzu Peng, they represent the first generation of China-born artists who could do both quite well. So Chen Wenxi and Chuang Tzu Peng kind of move fluidly between both. And for Lim Tze Peng, it turned out that he is similar in that respect. Because Tze Peng, although he started with calligraphy very young, but he had also an interest in oil painting. So which is why in the 60s, 70s, he was very active with the 10-man art group, and during that period, he was really primarily an oil painter, very much influenced by older artists like Liu Kang and Ye Zhiwei. And then it was later, after he retired in 1980s, that he went back to calligraphy and then to ink painting. So you can see, Tze Peng is a very versatile artist, kind of moving between oil painting and ink quite fluidly, at different stages of his life. So in that respect, he's a bit similar to our pioneer artists. The one aspect, I suppose, that makes Tze Peng quite outstanding is that with his ink practice, he kind of pushed it into a whole new direction, especially from the 2000 onwards, right? In the 1980s, 1990s, he was still, I would say, a fairly conventional ink painter, kind of looking at his surroundings, be it Chinatown, Singapore River, the kampongs, and then painting what he saw. Of course, in a very beautiful way, but essentially kind of recording down the world around him visually. And quite rare amongst our ink artists to be able to complete his ink painting on site, a plein air artist. They didn't have to go back to his studio to complete the work. But from 2000 onwards, he became quite old, and therefore no longer physically able to be outdoors to paint. But that was when I think we saw a great transformation in his practice, because he was now painting in the studio, which meant that the paper which he used could be very large, like sometimes 2 or 3 meters wide, which you cannot do outdoors. And of course, being indoors meant that he no longer needed to be constrained by what he saw. He could be in his studio and be very creative, rely on his memories, rely on his imagination to create very experimental works. So from the year 2000 onwards, we saw many breakthroughs with Tze Peng in terms of how he created very large format works, how he kind of broke away from a conventional way of writing calligraphy, and also pushing calligraphy towards a more abstract form of art. So I think those are some of Lim Tze Peng's main contributions.
What about for Melvin, given that you have focused so much on collecting Tze Peng's work, what do you think makes Tze Peng so popular among Singaporeans?
I I think some of you were here for the opening. I think I said this. I'll probably just repeat here. I think there are three things that are special for me for Tze Peng. Firstly, I mean, all the points said by Zvi is valid. It's all there in the records. But I think for me, the first is that he was one of the artists that painted Kampong series a lot. And why he does that, he really loves Singapore. And he thinks of himself as a very 本土的画家 and 土乡的画家. So he really wanted to record the scenes around him, and he painted street scenes, Singapore River, and these are the things that were representative to him. So he really loved Singapore. That's the first. Second thing, he actually invented a lot of the variations of the calligraphy that is different. The most famous is 糊涂字. But beside the 糊涂字, he actually added a lot of colors, a lot of variations to calligraphy. Calligraphy as we know it is just black ink on white paper, but as you can see in the exhibition later, he actually used color ink, and then he added a lot of colors in the background to frame calligraphy. To me, that is an invention that is quite different from the rest, and it was very systematic. He was able to change from one form to the other until he came to this form called the 糊涂字. And the third thing that is special for me is that, as I mentioned, he was the first artist to be invited to China, and I think remains to be so, in Beijing and Shanghai. So the story goes was that in 2008, this art director called Fan Dian came to Singapore on a visit, and he went to art retreat in 2008, and he saw Lim Tze Peng's works, and he was astonished and amazed, and he said, wow, this artist is very, very good. How he used Chinese ink to represent his paintings in this way. And he therefore invited Tze Peng to go to China to exhibit. And at that time, 2008, remember Tze Peng was already 85, 86 years old. And he was so inspired and so proud and so happy with his achievement. He painted a lot of very large paintings which he then brought to China to exhibit. So I think he's really, really special to me in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, on that note, do you guys have any opinions about the direction of the way the Chinese ink medium, something that's so rich in history, so archaic, the direction that is being pushed today in the global context, even by Singapore artists like Lim Tze Peng? Like, where do you think it's going to go, given that even the abstracting of calligraphy, the colors into calligraphy, is now something that is quite widely used in the East Asian art for these artists? Yeah.
Okay, quite a difficult question to answer. I would say if you compare the past with the present, in the past, Chinese calligraphy and in that respect, ink painting would have been the mainstream. It was the case in China for many years, and it also was the case in Singapore, at least up to the pre-war period. Chinese calligraphy and ink painting was the primary form of kind of artistic expression amongst the Chinese in Singapore, because you were educated in Chinese, you were taught in Chinese, and therefore learning the Chinese language was a must, and that was an easy entryway into calligraphy as well as ink painting. But I have to say that post-war, post-independence, I think the situation now in Singapore is very, very different. As mentioned by Melvin, we are now, in terms of our cultural affinity with China, with Chinese culture, is not more distant. now that we are an independent nation state. We use we use English as our working language at work as well as in school, and therefore our relationship with the Chinese language is also more distant. And therefore, I think right now you will see that although ink remains an area that quite a number of young artists are interested in, be it in calligraphy or in painting, it is now no longer the mainstream. It is quite a niche interest, which is why actually it's not taught as a formal course in Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, neither is it taught in LaSalle. Yeah. So if you are a young artist in Singapore, you really have to pursue it by learning from older artists or going overseas to study, Taiwan, China, for instance. But I'm happy to say that even amongst the smaller group of artists that we have here in Singapore, a number of them are pursuing new directions. We do see. So we have younger artists like, of course, Try K has since passed away, but then there are other practitioners like Hong Sek Chen, who are all trying to look at ink in very interesting ways and then exploring it in different directions. So this is something to be encouraged, and they are actually part of a much larger group of artists in China, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, who are all looking at ink in different dimensions. Some of them are looking at ink from a more conceptual concept. Some of them are looking at calligraphy in terms of this, what does it mean if you move beyond language? And then some, of course, are looking at ink to go towards a more formal way of expressions. Yeah. So I think there are different directions happening all around the world, and some of our ink artists in Singapore today are part of this growing movement.
So on that note, we are moving into the last question for the premise today. Mainly, I would like to hear your views about what do you think is the future of collecting Chinese ink in Singapore? Yeah. Do you feel like are there more things that could be done to encourage the pursuit of such collections, and whether something that on your personal end you feel is a mission that you would like to execute? Yeah, because it's getting increasingly rarer for collections to come out, even from the private collections. I think previously our speakers were talking about a time when all these works were being traded within Singapore, and then subsequently the pattern of trade reversed, and a lot of them went back into the Chinese market. And each time the works come out again, the prices are getting astronomical. So it's becoming even more and more precious for this collection that had been remaining in Singapore, some of them for over 50 years, passed through generations of Singapore collectors to actually be part of a Singapore heritage. So I know it's a difficult question, and I'm sure there isn't a right answer. I'll just like to invite you guys to sort of have a think and maybe share your views on this.
你讲的是那个年轻人要鼓励的话，就是希望有多一个人把它播出来了。因为新加坡的那个藏家是，我觉得本地的还好啦，本地的画家的市场还是有。那么中国艺术的话是渐渐的在减少了，因为回流的都回流了。那么老的藏家他们都，据我所知啊，他们都自己处理掉他们的产品了，所以要保持这个未来的市场哦，就是要多一点教育展览，让大家知道那个艺术的的发展，让他们产生兴趣哦。另外一个就是市场的那个增值也是很重要，其实增值也是一个重点，因为藏家有兴趣哈，对增值这方面是一个重点来的。兴趣是比较第二点是增值还是一个重点，所以 应该在这方面多多的影响他们呢。
So my thoughts about this, I guess, actually I've observed, like Melvin, that in Singapore we do see a growing group of collectors coming on board. They're becoming quite interested in Singapore art, which is great. And many of them are also quite open to collecting art beyond Singapore, be it from Southeast Asia or internationally. I admit the group of collectors collecting Chinese art is quite small, particularly Chinese ink, painting and calligraphy, and I suspect it's largely due to our environment here in Singapore, right? Being a more English, kind of a Western educated society. But I mean, I would like to use my own experience to encourage everyone, because I grew up in the English-speaking environment. I was educated in the usual Singaporean education system. I spoke English at home with my parents. I spoke English at work with my colleagues. But actually, when eventually I decided to pursue art history, I went to London to do my master's. And in that 1 year, I decided to take up a course on history of Chinese painting, taught entirely in English. So my lecturer, although he spoke very fluent Mandarin, was an Englishman, and I had to do all my essays in English. I read all the textbooks, reference books in English. And actually, from that 1 year of study, I found my interest in Chinese painting growing. And then eventually, as you get more interested in the topic, you find that, oh, maybe some of the English language books don't have the information that you need, and then you are forced to start looking at some Chinese books or searching for some Chinese videos online to help you in your research. And through that process, I also found that my confidence or my fluency in the language slowly grew, and that also helped deepen my interest in Chinese art. So I would say that even for a Singaporean collector, the English language could be an entry point for you to find out more about Chinese art, Chinese ink painting. So yeah, I'm not very pessimistic. In fact, I'm quite optimistic that it's possible for Singapore collectors to continue to build up a good collection of ink paintings here.
Actually, Mr. Low himself is a lawyer by training. So after some time as he grew, then he gravitated towards art. So it's a very good example of how, your interest as you grow older, you may gravitate towards art in a different way. So the question was, would I continue to collect Chinese ink paintings in a larger way? I don't see myself as only collecting Chinese ink paintings. Actually, I see myself as a Singaporean. So even in my collector name is星洲墨缘堂, I'm a Singapore collector. So naturally, my first port of call is Singapore art. So I do have quite a bit of Singapore art. I hope to maybe one day also do an exhibition when I have substantial, a bit better collection. But really, I think, and I noticed that even in China, when they collect Chinese ink, Shanghainese will collect Shanghai artists first. People in Beijing will collect the Beijing artists first. So there is always this natural inclination to collect your own, so-called your own. So I think it's very natural for Singaporeans to want to collect our own Singapore art. Then you feel that, okay. And there's also the point of being, do you think that the price will appreciate? I think they will eventually. But that's not the point. The point is, if we can, we just support our own local art. It's things that they were familiar with. And I think one day they eventually will find its a true level. But I see myself more as a Singapore collector rather than a Chinese art collector. I hope that answer the question. Maybe you can take some questions from the floor. Yeah.
Yeah, before we end, we'd like to ask if anyone from the floor has any questions for our speakers relating to even the works that you see in this exhibition, or any collecting questions? If not, we'll be ending the session. Can we please have a big round of applause for the speakers?
Uh, 非常感谢今天的机会啊。那我有个问题想问一下刘先生，我们知道中国的一些成功的拍卖行、一些收藏家，基本上都是从新加坡的回流起步的。那么我认为呢，新加坡的古质化的收藏也是非常丰富，从今天跟之前的一些秀海流展览我们都看得到。可是作为一个装裱修复师呢，我们最喜欢看的就是平常找一找各地的博物馆，在新加坡我们却很难找到，这样的中国质化，特别是古质化的一些展览。我想问一下，是什么一个原因？那么新加坡博物馆或者文物局它的库房情况到底是就在中国古质化方面是什么一个状况？多还是少？原因是什么？那么如果很多的话，但是没有目前给予足够的展览，以后的计划又是什么？好吧，谢谢。
Okay, I think what the gentleman had asked was, he's curious how come, although in Singapore there are all these good collections of Chinese ink painting, how come in our public museums, like say National Gallery or Asian Civilizations Museum, we don't find such works in the collection. So it is true. I think the observation is an accurate one. Based on my own knowledge of what's in the national collection, and of course the history of how the national collection was formed in Singapore, it was developed as early as the 19th century when the British established the Raffles Museum in Singapore. It had always developed with a Singapore-centric perspective. Of course, initially when the British were here, they really collected objects from Southeast Asia in order to better understand the region. But after we became independent, the government here concentrated on collecting the Singapore story. And of course, all the objects had to relate more to the Singapore story than what people were collecting. So as a result, unfortunately, in the early days, Singapore lost the opportunity to retain very good collections. So like the Liu Zuochou collection, Xu Baizai, eventually Mr. Liu Zuochou decided to donate his collection to Hong Kong, where it now has a permanent home. And that was because at the time the government felt that they just didn't have the facilities to build a new wing to house a collection of Chinese art, not Singapore art, right? So I would say that the situation has improved over the years, especially after 1996, when Singapore Art Museum was established. So this was Singapore's first visual art museum. And then in 2015, Singapore's second visual art museum was formed, National Gallery. So I think with these two art museums in place, you can see that both museums no longer have a Singapore-centric focus. Both of them don't say we only collect Singapore art. Both of them have a regional focus, and they also want to reflect how our Singapore artists have links to different parts of the world, including China, India, and other places. So you see that over the years, we have started to collect some examples, or we are more open to accepting donations from collections which are not Singapore art. So of course the most well-known example was Mr. Wu Guanzhong, the artist, deciding to donate over 100 paintings to Singapore. That was not only a remarkable decision by the artist, but it was also a very bold step by the Singapore Art Museum then to accept this large donation, knowing that it's an important collection, but it's not a Singapore collection. So I think from then on, we can see that the museums here start to pay more attention to the links between Singapore and the rest of the world. And one way that we demonstrate that is by looking at the possibility of accepting donations or artworks of non-Singapore art from collectors and donors. Yeah. So this is something that is a bit more recent, so which is why, of course, in the Singapore context, at National Gallery, at the Singapore Art Museum, you still don't see many examples of international art. But of course, over time, we hope to address that.
Hello, just a simple one. Just want to know how do you keep all these paintings to avoid white ends in our weather? I have this problem.
Okay, the gentleman's question was how in Singapore's climate do you store Chinese ink painting, right? So it is a problem in Singapore because Chinese ink painting is done on paper, and with paper you are quite prone to termites as well as what we call foxing, which is the kind of mold that could grow on paper. So essentially, in museums, how we try to prevent this or avoid this is to make sure that our paintings are stored in climate-controlled environment. So this means that the temperature and the humidity is kept at a constant level, right? It doesn't have to be very cold, it doesn't have to be very dry, but whatever temperature or humidity you have, make sure you maintain it. So you shouldn't suddenly, one day you switch on the aircon and the room becomes very cold, and then the next day you switch it off, then the room becomes very hot. So this kind of fluctuation tends to encourage a lot of mold that you see on paper works. Yeah. The other thing that collectors should also note is one reason why you don't see, for instance, famous painting by Chen Wenxi on display all the time in National Gallery is because the paintings have to rest. All the paintings here are color or ink done on paper, and once you expose them to light like this, even though it's UV controlled, fading will start. So it will start to fade bit by bit. Of course, if you look at it every day, you will not notice the fading. But after 50 years, 100 years, if you compare two photos, you will notice it has faded. Yeah. So within the museum, we have a rule, which is to say, if you have a painting that is on display for 1 year, it has to go to rest in storage in complete darkness for 5 years. Yeah. So if you put it on display for 5 years, you have to go on into storage for 20 years. Yeah. So that's the reason why in most museums you don't see the same ink painting on display for years and years. So this is not the same for oil paintings, which is why at the Louvre, the Mona Lisa is always on display, because oil paint doesn't fade in the same way as ink painting. Yeah. So that's the two things you need to take into consideration.
Right, so we hope we have not successfully discouraged anyone from collecting Chinese inks. But maybe from the private collector side, how do you guys, pertaining to your own collection, how do you take care of these works? 想请问你们是怎么在家中的这些中国画，你们是怎么自己照顾然后收藏？
我们照顾方法没有像那个国家美术馆这样的成本啊，我们是以传统可能大家可能没有听过吧，我们是用胡椒粒，我们一包一包的胡椒粒，早期我们的那个我们是放在那个香嘛木箱的话，我们就丢几包那个胡椒粒放在里面， 就放住就这样。pepper，一包一包包住，就整包就丢进去。你要包住，因为包住的话，它会变粉，变粉的话，你的话就会弄到。这是传统早期的。
Peppercorn, so and defer the pest.
Okay, so at home, I hang them in some airy places. And I mean, I hang them for quite many years. So far, I think the deterioration is okay. It's not too bad. The only thing, just now your question was actually termites. So we have two problems in Singapore, termites and wood borrows. So you got to look at the paintings. I mean, as long as you keep appreciating your paintings, you will see if there's degradation in terms of the insect attacks. If there's so if you keep it in an airy place, it's generally okay. So for some of the more expensive paintings, so I keep them in the aircon room, which is 24 hours. So they don't like fluctuations. I mean, just keep it at a constant temperature. That's fine. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? If not, I would like to really thank my two speakers here today, Mr. Lo Ziwi and Mr. Yo, for coming to share with us so many valuable insights. Yeah.
Thank you everyone once again for spending your afternoon with us. We hope you've enjoyed the talk today, and feel free to hang around to chat and ask us more questions on anything relating to collecting or the artworks that you see in this exhibition hall. Thank you.